AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on Autoline After Hours. We got a good show today, Gary. We're going to talk a lot about what's going on in the labor movement in the auto industry in the United States.
And the Volkswagen situation. And we've got two people who know probably more about labor and the Volkswagen situation than any other two people we can discover.
Right. We've got Marick Masters, who's been on the show before from Wayne State University.
Yes.
Yeah, great to have you back here.
Pleasure to be here. Good to see both of you.
And Martinez from Automotive News. And yeah, Gary's right. You were feet on the ground, boots on the ground down in Chattanooga, right?
That's right. I was there about a week before the voting to sort of get a sense for what's going on the ground and try to really get inside this sort of revamped strategy that the UAW has. I learned a lot. Excited to share it today.
Yeah, well, let's hear. What were your impressions down there? I mean, what was the vibe?
The vibe was really energetic. They were very confident that they would win. I don't think anybody really predicted the kind of landslide that we eventually saw. But I saw a lot of workers who had learned from their past mistakes. And I thought that was key.
What do you mean?
To this victory. One thing, I'll tell you, anecdotally, they said in past elections in 2014 and 2019, one thing they did was home visits, door knocking, which is sort of a staple of organizing drives. You talk to your coworkers at their homes. Maybe they'll invite you in for coffee. You have more time to talk. But in 2019, I guess a lot of the workers down in Chattanooga did not like that. And that was sort of a pitfall that they avoided this time around. They said, okay, they got angry with us before. We're going to avoid that this time. We're just going to hand out our cards, talk to them on our breaks. So that's one thing they avoided. Another thing that was different was VW's stance itself. And I think this was another big key. They committed to remaining neutral. And that was not the case in 2019. They hosted the Republican Governor Bill Lee, who gave sort of an anti-union message. They had a lot of captive audience meetings with their workforce. They didn't do any of that this time. In fact, I took a tour of the plant. And again, about a week before the election, you saw monitors in the main hallway that workers come through every day to go to their lockers and get ready for their shifts. And the monitors said, reminding them there is an election. And there were slogans like, we're VW and we vote, or vote for the workplace that you want. And it encouraged them to vote and told them even if they had signed a support card, that still didn't count as a vote. They still needed to vote. So they weren't leaning one way or the other. They were still telling them there was a vote. They were being open about it. And they weren't as antagonistic or as openly hostile as they were the time before.
Mm-hmm. Marick, you got to see this as a historic shift in the unionization of the first transplant to get unionized.
Well, as he said, it's a classic lesson in organizational learning. The UAW learned something. And under Shawn Fain's leadership, they listen. And so they listen to the workers there. And when they tell you that they don't want them to come to their house, they don't want it publicized that UAW people are coming around talking to them. They would prefer to operate more within their own networks, disseminate the information themselves, and also rely more on social media. And so the UAW took the approach that rather than helicoptering in and trying to organize and saying, we'll show you how to organize a plant, they said, tell us what we need to do to get organized. One of the things that I think was very interesting about this, which may foretell something very positive in Mercedes, is the UAW was successful in translating its authorization card signatures into votes. There wasn't a gap. Now, part of that was due to the proximity between the petition and the election. There wasn't much time, and the same thing is true with what's going on in Mercedes. But they went in with over 70%, got 73% of the vote, and not quite 100% turnout, but a very high turnout. And then they may be in a position to replicate that at Vance. That's why I wouldn't be surprised if they won substantially there as well.
So do you see this being Shawn Fain's approach? I mean, because the UAW has been trying to organize a number of plants for decades now.
It's his approach and the people around him. He has a whole new group of people around him that are much more attuned, much more media, digital savvy, and are willing to listen and have been out on the ground more, have a better connection to the new generation of workers And it's important to remember since 2014, there's probably been a lot of turnover in that plant, even since 2019. And they're good at listening and getting a sense of what people want. And they're also exploiting a more favorable environment more generally.
This is for both of you. This is something that I don't understand. On January 18th of this year, Volkswagen Group of America put out a press release, which opens, Volkswagen Group of America today announced that the Top Employers Institute has certified it as a top employer for 2024. It goes on to say, Volkswagen's focus on employee well-being goes well beyond traditional benefits. The company offers a range of initiatives designed to enhance the employee experience, blah, 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 blah. So this is the third time in a row that they've won this award for being presumably a place that cares about its people. How did this happen?
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting. The workers I spoke with down there said, we're noticing as we get closer and closer to this election, or as more and more people sign these cards, VW is really reminding us about all these strange benefits that we don't even realize we have. They're doing a very good job talking themselves up and pretending to be better than how we feel they actually are. But, to that point, Gary, I think VW has traditionally offered good wages and good benefits, maybe not as great as the Detroit 3 and the unionized factories, though. And what the workers told me is, we have it pretty good now. It could be better, but the main thing that we want, we don't care how good of a employer they claim to be or how good of an employer they in fact are. We just want more security because we don't have a contract with them. So if they're a great employer today, they could turn around and change that tomorrow. They don't necessarily have to offer us the same things they're doing today. So there's just this air of uncertainty around a lot of what they were getting. Now, that's not to say that Volkswagen would do that or would suddenly start to abuse them, but the workers said they just wanted more security and that sort of reassurance that a contract in black and white would actually provide.
I would say that there's often a disconnect between these so-called surveys of employee satisfaction, how they determine who are the top-ranked employers in terms of an employment setting, and the reality. If you connect with the workers, they're going to look at who is their plant management, and plant management will, as it was noted, they will get savvy about management when you get close to an election. And the workers are smart enough to know that they're doing a lot of this, the 11% raise that they adopted after the heels of the contract, that was all done in response to the UAW's push. And a lot of what occurs in terms of messaging and trying to maybe assuage concerns will be done in response to a union organizing effort. The workers know that. What they also will be looking at is how much do they trust this top management? When they see management behaving very mercurially like that, what they can give, they can take away. It's how they treat them day in and day out. How do they treat them in terms of scheduling? How do they treat them in terms of handling their shifts and issues that come up on a regular basis where they depend on good supervisory employee relations? You don't know much about that connection, and that's a central one in terms of organizing on the ground. And I would also say there's another factor in here that, Volkswagen Group is very much an international company, and they may have concerns about the real leadership of the company and how much the local decisions are actually influenced by those that are made far away. And they may not have such a good feeling about their more distant leadership.
I don't know if it's still true, but it has been true that the Chattanooga plant was the only Volkswagen plant in the world that did not have some sort of union or works council representation. Could it be that as you guys know, the supervisory board of Volkswagen or any German company has to be made up of, half of it has to be labor representation? Could it be that the people in Germany are like, hey, what the heck? This is the only plant that doesn't have any representation. Chattanooga management, you better not be fighting this thing.
Go, I'll let you.
Yeah, I'd say the point I would make is that from the union, the Works Council side overseas, they were quietly and sometimes not so quietly pushing VW and the council overseas to, recognize, or stay neutral, do not interfere, let the workers decide, because they deserve to have representation just like we do. So I think a key element of this was that international cooperation between the unions overseas. And, if you go back in Volkswagen's history, there's the Westmoreland, Pennsylvania plant that was unionized, because when VW opened up, I believe it was the 70s, right? They saw everybody else, all the other plants in the United States had unions, and all their other facilities were unionized. So they just sort of took it as a matter of inevitability. So I think it was just card check recognition. They said, okay, yeah, well, card check, sure. Well, we'll unionize everywhere else is, right? So in its history, Volkswagen has been open to unionization.
Well, they operate under a different model. The European and German model is different from the U.S. model. It is more of a partnership model in which labor participates in management through various boards. In the U.S., the model has been collective bargaining, which is a more adversarial approach in which the parties remain institutionally separate. Labor is not part of management. Its view has always been that if we become part of management in any co-deterministic way, we will be the junior partners in success and the senior partners in failure. And they want to preserve their independence, their autonomy. There isn't a view here that we're part of a, if you will, a uniparty, that we believe that workers' interests are the same as management's interests, and therefore we shouldn't have any clash. I think it's a much more, it's more like a courtroom setting, that you go in there and advocate your case. And I think they want to maintain that independence and that autonomy. And I would go to a point that I think has really been overlooked in terms of Sean Fain's position. When he says the UAW was too cozy with management, in part he means because of those joint training centers, which were the source of so much difficulties. Those were financed by the companies and administered jointly by the union and the companies, and they became quasi-social welfare organizations that funded a lot of projects that the leadership of the union and or the management wanted funded. Had nothing to do with training per se. When you're building baseball stadiums in Detroit from these funds, that's a much different task than training workers on the new technologies that you need in order to be productive in the workplace.
But Marick, as you know, they raised so much money, they had to find ways to spend it.
Well, it was a formula-driven thing. When it was, one of the former executives at General Motors told me at one time he oversaw part of the fund. He said at one time they had $750 million in that fund.
Yeah.
I remember, that's a lot of money.
All right, so let's explain this fund, though, so that the viewers who are not deep into the UAW Big Three relationship. So this was established because
in the 1980s to make the companies more productive. And they thought that a joint training program between the workers and the union would enable them to have money to fund management and labor jointly on new techniques, new forms of management, lean management, those kinds of
and
things.
robots
and new technology coming
new
into
technologies
the plants.
and those kinds of things. It was funded. They were established via the collective bargaining agreements and established by formula. They were sort of nicknamed the nickel fund. And there was a certain percentage of money set aside that for every hour worked, it would go into this joint
I
training
think it started
fund.
out as a nickel.
Yeah.
Every hour, you threw a nickel in the fund.
And so that's what they did. And it built up depending upon the number of hours you had working. And the companies had discretion over how to spend this money with the union. They were jointly managed with their own boards. They had people that were officers of the union and representatives of the HR departments of the companies running these things. At General Motors, and I think at Ford, they did a much better job in auditing and making certain that these things were well done. They were more lax at FCA, at Chrysler, and it led to some abuses that proliferated and to the the embezzlement of several $1 million by mainly union officials, but to some extent at Chrysler executives.
Right.
And
But
so that was it was spent on a variety of purposes, originally intended for training, but then they spent money on a variety of other things, and they gave money also from these training centers to the charities that were supported by the union leaders.
So it started out as being a very noble thing, started out as being something that would be very useful in a technologically changing industry, and yet it
Well, and also the UAW, what the UAW did with them was to say, okay, we'll assign some of our people to these joint training centers, but you're going to have to pay for them out of the joint training center funds, which are company funds. And you're also going to have to pay an administrative fee to us, which was essentially a profit to them of 7%. And that's where they got into some difficulties because they were finding that they were subsidizing people who weren't doing anything.
my understanding too was that per the contract, all that money had to be spent by the end of the contract. It could not accumulate and get rolled over. And so they would come to the close to the end of the contract and have gobs of money left over. And if you'll remember in 2019, Ford had so much money and they were scrambling, figuring out ways of how to spend it. They decided, give everybody a free computer and free internet access. And then they decided, well, if we're giving the UAW people all the free stuff, we got to give everybody else the free stuff too. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's how much money was in the fund. And then GM, they built what I call the Taj Mahal of a training center down on the Detroit River. I mean, the money that went into that
They
building.
also had a pretty big one at Ford too. And so they, and I might say parenthetically on that, there was a lot of swag that was contracted by these joint training centers for the UAW workers that would attend these training programs, which might be, and they would contract with somebody who would produce the jackets, the other accessories that they wanted to distribute to rank and file. And some of the vendors were really doing this and overcharging and pocketing the money and then kicking it back to union leaders. That was more prevalent at GM.
Mhm.
So Mike, you mentioned the governor of Tennessee, and what was it, a week or two before the election, the governors of Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas came out with a letter saying, we are concerned about the unionization campaign driven by misinformation and scare tactics that the UAW has brought into our states. As governors, we have a responsibility to our constituents to speak up when we see special interests looking to come into our state and threaten our jobs and the values we live by. And it goes on from there and it says, unionization would certainly put our state's jobs in jeopardy. In fact, this year already, all of the UAW automakers have announced layoffs.
Yep.
So, two questions to you guys. How does that resonate with people who are not in the auto industry? And B, what is the legitimacy of their claim?
Well, I'd say they have a point. And if we're talking about things that have changed or not changed between past organizing drives and this one, this is something that hasn't changed. It's the political establishment in some of these southern states pushing back against unionization. And they tend to make the same points as they have been for years. And that's one of them is that if an automaker unionizes, their labor costs are probably going to go up substantially. And if their costs go up, would they be as willing to invest in the future in this state? Or would they pick another state, possibly even another country? And it's the same argument you hear even from the automakers, Ford, GM, and Stellantis during contract negotiations every 4 years. We heard it last fall. I think there's some truth to that, right? It's basic business. If your costs are going to go up as a company, as an organization, you want to look for the lowest cost opportunities to build a vehicle. The workers will say that that's a scare tactic, right? So you're using this term on both sides here. But the governors, they're pointing to these layoffs. I think it's a little more nuanced than that. You sort of have to take them on a case-by-case basis. Although the argument could be made that I believe in the case of Stellantis, there's some supplemental workers they're laying off. These past UAW contracts dramatically raised the pay rate for temporary supplemental workers. So if you're Stellantis, maybe you don't use as many and you just rely more on your permanent full-time employees. So there's a case to be made. The workers, the pro-union supporters would argue that the governors are taking this a little too far. But you can't really ignore some of the economics and some of the things that are happening in Detroit.
Well, I would say the governors are reflecting the sentiment of employers and other major donors to both sets of parties. One thing I can say about American business in general, and those I would include in that a mix of foreign companies that invest in the United States, is that when they invest here, regardless of their workplace relations in their country of origin, they want to maintain a union-free environment. I don't care how liberal they are in terms of other issues. When it comes to unions, you can count on companies being anti-union, and they're playing into that. What I thought was interesting, as Mike said, was that you didn't see as much of that in the Chattanooga campaign. You saw a lot of it in 2014, 2019, much more mobilized on the ground. And I would expect that what this election at Chattanooga has done, and it will be only amplified if they win at Vance in Alabama at Mercedes, is that you will see these anti-union forces become much more aggressive in terms of what they do on the ground and mobilizing at the grassroots level among the work sites themselves, the surrounding communities, and the lawmakers. Georgia, I think, is interesting, just passed a law that the governor signed, and this is a Republican governor, although he's not President Trump's favorite governor, I might say, Kemp, but I should say that he signed a law which said that you cannot continue to get the incentives of the state that they gave to companies for investing in the auto industry there. You will relinquish those if you voluntarily recognize the union. So I think that one thing that's interesting is that Volkswagen never voluntarily recognized the union. It could always do that. And I think what the UAW has done in Volkswagen and Mercedes by filing unfair labor practice charges, and the other companies as well, set the stage that if they don't win the election, they're going to ask for the National Labor Relations Board to issue a mandatory bargaining order and say you have to bargain with them because you interfere with the election and there's no point in having another election.
Wow.
If I could make a point, though, talking about the opposition, I would agree, maybe not as organized and as forceful as it has been in past elections, but I'd also say maybe some of their arguments aren't as resonant anymore. From what I saw when I went down there were a whole lot of anti-union yard signs, and they just sprouted up a couple days before I arrived, a week before the election. And the yard signs sort of fell into a few categories. There were one trying to attach the UAW to Democrats. UAW equals Biden, say no to Sleepy Joe. Those were a few of the slogans. Another one was remember Westmoreland. That plant eventually closed. The opposition was trying to insinuate that it was because of the union that it closed, which historically I'm not sure that that's the strongest argument. The other key part of their argument is that the union is or was corrupt, and that's something they can't really hit them on anymore because of the fact that you have Shawn Fain and a whole new slate of leaders who were democratically elected. You do have a federal monitor overseeing things, and you have these sort of checks and balances in place, so you don't have the disaster and the embezzlement that stemmed from the training centers and from the disgraced former presidents that were sent to prison. So a big piece of the opposition's argument against unionization is sort of null and void these days. And on the other side, you have a union that's really racking up a lot of wins that they couldn't point to before. And now they have something tangible in the form of the Detroit 3 contracts to show the workers down south, hey, you want cost of living reinstated? You want a 25% raise? 11 is pretty good, but why not 25 over 4 or 5 years, right? How about profit sharing bonus? That's something Volkswagen workers don't have. So the union can now point to things to say they only got that because of us. You can get it too.
I love the point that you're making here, Marick, is that we'll probably see stronger anti-union forces. These Republican governors must be horrified. I mean, they took a very strong stance, as Gary just read the statement there, and they lost resoundingly. This is a presidential election year. I mean, there's a lot at stake What do you think might happen in Alabama at the Mercedes plant?
Well, the governor there is very vocal in her opposition and has issued statements earlier to the effect that we don't want the unions. And I think this joint statement was issued from her office, I believe.
Yeah.
And I think Mike raises a really point, and there's a nuance and a subtlety to this which shouldn't be overlooked, and that is historically the Republican Party, which used to have a liberal faction under Rockefeller and Romney, but that dissipated in the 1980s under Reagan, and it became much more of a quasi-libertarian party. And I think that, get government off the back of business, tax breaks, et cetera, and anti-union. You saw after the election of 2010 when the Tea Party really caused the change in the makeup of the Congress and state legislatures, that they went after the unions across the public sector and in the private sector as well. The Trump movement is more of a populist movement, and they are not as viscerally anti-union. They will go after the union leadership and want to appeal directly to the union members. So Trump, I don't think he would issue a statement like this, sort of like Nikki Haley did, and she could be called almost the governor of Boeing. She was vocal about being opposed. We don't need the UAW. We don't need the machinists here, all of those kinds of things. But they want to get workers that are unionized to vote for them. And so they're going to appeal to the working class. And their appeal to the working class is going to be exactly what Trump did when he came in here, when Biden appeared the same week on the picket lines, and Trump came in a day or two later in Michigan and came in and talked to the non-union auto supplier and said, the UAW workers deserve a pay raise, but I hate to tell them that their strike doesn't matter because all these jobs are going to go to China. Because of the EV policy and mandates of this administration, the Chinese are going to be able to import a lot of lower cost EVs and take over the international market. And that's sort of what Elon Musk has insinuated continuously, that he expects that maybe in the next few years, 9 of the 10 largest auto companies in the world will be Chinese.
Mm-hmm. So let me read a quote here from Joe Biden after the vote was successful for the union. Biden said, in part, 6 Republican governors wrote a letter attempting to influence workers' votes by falsely claiming that a successful vote would jeopardize jobs in their states. Let me be clear to the Republican governors that tried to undermine this vote. There is nothing to fear from American workers using their voice and their legal right to form a union if they so choose. In fact, the growing strength of unions over the last year has gone hand in hand with record small businesses and job growth alongside the longest stretch of low unemployment in more than 50 years. I will continue to stand with American workers and stand against Republicans' efforts to weaken workers' voices. So how is that going to play in Peoria?
Yeah, I mean, well, you talk about populist sentiment, right? He's appealing directly to workers as well. But I think the issue is, if you're a company, you may have no choice. If your costs are going up significantly. One thing Volkswagen pointed out to me when I took that tour, and they were trying to tell me how great they were to work for. One thing they said is that in Chattanooga, they haven't had any permanent layoffs. They haven't laid anybody off, even through the or in the immediate aftermath of the Great Recession when the plant opened. So, will that change? I think it'd be premature to speculate or suggest. And could you blame it all on the union if it does change? I'm not sure. But, there's this feeling that, as long as the workers have some protections through a union, that maybe things might be okay for them. So, but I think the Mercedes plant, that'll be an interesting test. We talk about how historic this was for VW, a decade in the making. Honestly, really, now comes the hard part, right? This was maybe the lowest hanging fruit for the union.
Doesn't Mercedes pay profit sharing? I seem to remember hearing at some point that they were getting like $5,000 in profit sharing at the Vance plant.
They may very well get a profit sharing plan. I haven't checked that out to determine, but that's a good point. What exactly benefits do they have? Or perks that go into their compensation package? All those things will be considerations. But I think it's interesting that 70% of the workers there signed an authorization card. And if you're doing that in Vance, Alabama, that's a pretty strong statement, I think, that that an election is right around the corner. And the National Right to Work Committee has been pretty vocal. It was in Chattanooga, and I'm certain to some extent in Vance it's gotten the word out that if you sign an authorization card, you are guaranteeing that an election will take place, and you need to be careful about doing that. Because the National Labor Relations Board is going to be very, very, insistent on having an election. They've got expedited NLRB procedures now to hold elections sooner after the filing of the petition. All those things are going to work, I think, to the advantage of the union. I want to go back to what you said about Joe Biden. If you look at polls will tell you that Biden's performance on the economy rates pretty low. And if you look at real wages, they have gone down under Biden's administration, and even the UAW pointed that out as part of its effort to raise wages under its new contract, although it didn't mention Biden by name. And I know that the union leadership, lock, stock, and barrel, say that they support unions, but I've never considered, I was a Biden supporter in 1987. That's how old I am. And his presidential campaign didn't last very long. And I saw him again in 1991 when he came into Pennsylvania to campaign for Harris Wofford. And I remember at a meeting with us, a small group of people, he talked about how important it was to work across the aisle and talked about his good relationship and how he drank bourbon and branch water with Senator James Easton of Mississippi, segregationists. And when I've heard stories recently, he's always talking about having lunch. You can get lunch. When he talks about being the most pro-union president in American history, his record now is not necessarily stack up that well. I wouldn't compare him to a Teddy Kennedy or Hubert Humphrey or anything of that nature. I think he plays well to the audience. But you raised an interesting point. What's the argument going to be to get working class people to vote for you? He's made his appeal. I stand on the picket lines. I formed this organizing empowerment thing, but union membership continued to decline as a percentage of the workforce. And wages have continued with inflation upticking recently. Real wages have gone down, started to go down again after rising a little bit in the past year. So I think people are going to say, we're very uncertain in the transition to EVs about what this industry is going to look like, what the profitability of the companies are going to be, and what our jobs are going to be. And these non-union companies are going to say, we invested here in non-union facilities without having the expectation of we have a UAW workforce. And if they do have a UAW workforce, we may have to rethink our footprint, as Jim Farley said.
Very interesting. Look, we got to take a quick commercial break. I want to get back. When we come back from that, I want to talk to you guys about the tactics that the union is using. But first, a shout out to our sponsor, Bridgestone.
When the peace and quiet of your morning commute is as comforting as your morning macchiato, that's what really matters. Bridgestone Turanza EV tires. Less noise for more quiet comfort.
All right, we're back talking. As I said, I want to ask you guys about union tactics. Marick, you raised the point that, there's been this super majority of signing the card check. But we've seen that happen in the past. Maybe not quite a super majority, but a clear majority of workers, including at Chattanooga the last time around, signed a card that, yep, they wanted a union. But when it's time to go into a vote in a secret ballot, they did not vote in favor of the union. What changed this time?
Well, I can tell you in the case of Volkswagen down in Chattanooga, they were cognizant that an authorization card signature doesn't equal a yes vote in an election. So instead of solely relying on the cards, they tried to build a network of support from within the plant. Every shift, every line, every department. And instead of having, as in the past, they sort of had an organizing committee of about, I think, 10, 15% of the overall plant workforce. That was what they shot for. This time they had, I think, a couple hundred workers. I don't know what that translates to percentage wise on the organizing committee, but then they sort of tried to deputize other people. They called them, I believe, election captains or leaders, something to that effect. Again, every line, every department. And those leaders would be in charge of, getting the word out to between 10 or 20 people next to them on the assembly line in their department. So there was this really conscious effort to have this network of support and at least be able to reach every single person in the plant. And by getting to that 70%, they knew, okay, even if a few people drop off, we have enough to be 50% plus one, which is all we need in an election. And as Marick pointed out, they did even better. They got 73% of the overall vote there.
Yeah, I would say Mike is right on target with that. That in fact, they listed those members on their website at Chattanooga, and it's close to 200 people. Yeah, a very impressive list. And what they're doing is a strategy. They're in legislative politics, you call it whipping the vote. And so you get people to say, I'm with you. Well, that's fine, but we're going to hold you to your word. Now, they may not put it that way, but they'll say, we're going to make certain that you know when the vote's taking place. If you need any help, we want to make certain. And then you have people, captains, sort of watching the vote and making certain that people get out. And so they're able to translate that in. And the closer the election is to the time period they filed the petition, the less time the employer has to come in through legal devices and other things to change the equation. So as long as they can keep that time period relatively proximate, I think they will have they'll be ready to do whatever they can. This is grassroots politics 101 that they're practicing. And that, I think, is part of, as opposed to the helicopter, the top-down, the heavy-handed approach that the UAW had in the past, in which you talk to a lot of UAW members, they hated the international UAW as much as they hated the companies.
Right.
I mean, there was no love lost there.
Another change that I see is in prior election or unionization drives, particularly at Nissan, the UAW tried to make it all about social justice, particularly in Mississippi. And this time it seems to be a focus on economics. We can make your life better rather than we can make the world a better place through social justice. Do you guys see that?
100%. And I think even in prior Volkswagen drives, they tried to use the idea of joining a works council, just like every other plant. So maybe more nebulous concepts that the average rank and file worker didn't quite get. But if you're talking about, a 25% raise versus an 11% raise, if you're talking about actual money, actual stability, that's something they can really relate to. And that's something, I talked with workers at Mercedes as well, and that's resonating with them. And if you look back in the union's organizing history at Mercedes, they didn't even get to a vote before advance. They couldn't even get enough support to call for an election. And the fact that they have gotten to that supermajority, I think this time is pretty telling. And again, it's sort of the same formula as VW. It's worker-led. Talked with one of the members down there, Jeremy Kimbrell. He's been part of the past efforts, and he says it's a night and day difference. And I think a point that goes reinforces that is when they reached the 50% threshold with authorization cards. The union put out, as they've done really well lately on social media, a video on Facebook, Twitter, etc. And it was Jeremy Kimbrell standing behind a podium with his fellow coworkers behind him. It was not Shawn Fain. And we all know Shawn Fain loves a camera. He loves doing that. But instead, they let the workers actually lead this announcement and lead this organizing drive.
So basically, does it come down to vote yes if you like money, vote no if you don't like money?
Money, security, just stability, I think, for the future. That's what I had heard.
I think it's having a voice in these things that you otherwise do not have, and not being at the whim of management. If you don't have a union representing you, you can be concerned about social justice, but workers are not going to be concerned about that in some sort of an abstract way. They're going to be very concerned about what that means to them at the work site. And that means to them, well, do they have what they consider to be a just wage? And for temporary workers, that they got 168% wage increase at Stellantis, I think, That's a big move towards social justice in their mind. But also another thing is going to be, how are they treated in terms of the assignment of these work schedules and working hours and all kinds of other things. They're going to be watching that, and if they have a mechanism for grieving that, that's a check on management whim, so to speak. So they're going to look at this as being part of, the UAW said, you tell us what you want. I think this is, sometimes people can get mad at Sean Fain and blame him when he came out and said, I want retiree health care restored, and I want defined benefit plans restored. But when he also issued his demands, he said, these are the members' demands. These are not the presidential demands, as they were previously called. That's what the workers told him they wanted. And that didn't mean that he was going to go in there and argue for everything with equal vigor. But he knew they wanted a big pay raise. That's part of social and economic justice, and they wanted other things. And to push the conversation as far as he could, including the 4-day work week, which has got a lot more of attention than it has heretofore. But I think he listened and said, we'll act on what you want. You tell us what you want, and we'll push those issues, and we'll tell you what we are able to do. And it's important to remember that a large portion of the workers in the South at these sites are minority workers, and they don't like to be patronized. They don't want people coming and say, oh, it's all about social justice. But no, it's how much you're going to raise my pay, how much you're going to protect my job. That's real justice to me. And if you're not going to do those things, then talking about all of these other things doesn't matter.
Guys, I can give you a quick, perfect example. I talked with Isaac Meadows down at VW. He's been there for about 14 months, and he starts to put parts on vehicle bodies as soon as they come out of the paint shop. And he told me a very sort of mundane example, but he said there was one day on his shift where there was some issue with production, so it was sort of held up, and they extended their first break time, I believe, by a half hour, 40 minutes, something like that. But then to catch up later on, they shortened their second break time down to 5 or 10 minutes. And that was an example. He said, I don't want my employer just to be able to change my shift patterns, change my break times willy-nilly. I want to have it in writing and be able to take my breaks when I'm supposed to take my breaks. So there's one example.
Mm-hmm. No, good example. Do you guys think that there will be a difference when the union goes after Toyota and Honda? And I only ask that because my perception is they've done a terrific job of working with their employees, getting them engaged in things, treating them very well. That's my perception, but I'd love to get your thoughts of the success the union might have against particularly Toyota and Honda, not necessarily the other Japanese, versus what we've seen with Volkswagen and maybe even Mercedes.
Well, one thing, when I hear that, I appreciate it, and I appreciate the effort of part of management to treat its employees well, but that can be viewed as paternalism, that they go in and...
Japanese culture is very paternalistic.
Yeah, you go in there and you say, well, we're going to give you what you want, and everybody operates as a team, and we collaborate, and we like to play good with each other in the sandbox. That's nice, but when push comes to shove and you have to make a decision, what voice do I have in it? And I think that's the question that the union is going to be pushing them to ask, because otherwise you're really at the mercy of what they decide. You're not going to have any influence over where they locate product. What they locate here, they can take away. What they do in terms of, any kinds of benefits they give you, any kinds of accommodations they give you in work scheduling, whatever. A manager at that point in time could have decided, well, we're going to give you an extra half an hour at the end of the day, but that's my choice. I may not do it next time. And if my senior management comes in and says, don't you dare do that again, we've got to get this product out, then he or she is not going to do that again. I think that's the viewpoint that they're going to have. And I sometimes think when we look at how well people treat employees, I know a lot of managers that think they treat their employees very well. And then you go talk to the employees and they say, I don't know what he or she is talking about, but we don't have that feeling, that same feeling.
So Mike mentioned Jim Farley's point about we'll have to reconsider our footprint in the United States in the future. So, I mean, what is going to prevent Ford from saying, okay, when we make product X, we're not going to be making it here. We're going to make it somewhere else. To your point about whether Toyota or Honda or Nissan or whomever would basically say, you know what, we won't do it here. We'll do it elsewhere.
Well, I mean, that's a management prerogative. You can negotiate to some extent, as they do in the auto industry, over where product is located and produced. The extent to which you can push that to a strike, I mean, that's part of management prerogative. So I think that the auto companies are probably being generous in negotiating those things so much with the United Auto Workers. But I would say that you really have to be cognizant of the fact that this is a management decision, and that only if you are able to have some sort of influence one way or the other over management's decisions. And that becomes very hard if you're part of a board and have to go along with board decisions and those kinds of things. But if you are part of an oppositional force, if you will, and can raise the cost to management of doing the same thing, I think it's interesting because Ford always at the beginning talked about, we treat our workers well, and we spend $1 billion more on our workers, and we're very proud to do it. And we have more workers in the United States than the other companies. And then at the end of this negotiation, what you hear is that, we didn't particularly like the way we were treated by the UAW. They went out on strike. They didn't give us any brownie points for all the good things that we've done in the past, and therefore we're going to look at our footprint.
What I would say, though, that we also need to keep in mind with, whether you call it a threat or whatever, what Farley said there, about a week, I think the ink was still drying on these contracts. About a week after the strike ended and they had signed these things, the CFOs for Ford and General Motors came out because it was quarterly earnings time, and they both said, oh yeah, labor costs, yeah, they're going to go up, but yeah, no big deal. We can offset it next year. We'll be fine. We just have to find some manufacturing efficiencies here and some other cuts there, and we can fully offset the increase in labor costs. So for all the rhetoric, for all the complaining, quite frankly, from either side, at the end of the day, yeah, if their costs did go up, they seem to just brush it off and say no big deal.
I'll tell you, in my opinion, that was a message to Wall Street. Okay, we went through this whole thing, but don't you guys worry. Our stock price is going to be fine. Our earnings are going to be great.
Sure.
Meanwhile, we just saw GM and Ford's earnings come out this week. GM is doing less than a 7% profit margin. Ford's at a 3% profit margin. That's not sustainable in an industry as competitive as what we're seeing right now, with this very tentative switch over to EVs, tens of billions having been invested. There's earning zero return. The Chinese breathing down their neck. So when the CFOs go, don't worry about it, we'll adjust. That's a Wall Street message.
I think that you raise an interesting point, and it's why sometimes the parties don't trust each other. And you have, right at the end of the contract, up to that contract, they were pleading, we can't give any more. We've reached the limit. This is the absolute limit. And then next week they'd say, this is the absolute limit. And Sean Fain said, I don't believe you.
He called their bluff.
And so they don't believe them. It often depends on who you're talking to, whether you're talking to your shareholders, whether you're talking to suppliers or the workers or the politicians. But I think you raised an interesting point here that the companies bet their house on Ford and GM on EVs. And they knew, and the workers knew, that they were not going to be as profitable in that transition. It just wasn't in the cards. And so therefore, their choice was, do we get as much as we can now, or maybe hold off on some other things in the hope that we can get a little bit later? And I don't think they were willing to take that risk because they knew that the future is very uncertain. Get what you can now and then hope for the best, because it's going to be very difficult to remain viable in this competitive environment.
Absolutely. And that's why I raised at the time last year the specter of winning the battle and losing the war on the part of the union. This industry is undergoing change like it's never seen before. I can easily paint a picture where GM and Ford don't exist by 2040. So, and I'm not saying that the union shouldn't be asking for what it did. It should, absolutely. But having a strategy that was designed to financially hurt them too, and it cost them dearly. The shutdown at the Michigan truck plant, I mean, that really hurt. They ran out of Ranger. That Ford sold 0 Ranger pickups in February. That's how much that launch was disrupted.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the cost of wages and benefits is one thing, but the strikes and some of the other burden that you get with having a union, especially in terms of work rules and lines of demarcation,
Well, I think
that's a problem.
That's what really these non-union companies fear more than the wages and pure compensation. It's these extra things that make the cost of doing business so difficult. You don't have the degrees of freedom. You don't have the flexibility. It's harder to make change in the workforce. And you're dealing with competing institutions and competing loyalties. So anytime you have a union representing the workers there, that is an independent third party. And your workers, when they act as representatives of the union and dealing with management, become protected in their actions. So you can't just, a worker can come into your office representing the union and argue a point, and you can't really say, well, you're insubordinate and get out of here. We're going to fire you. Well, you have a grievance. You may be able to do it and get away with it, but it could be an illegal act nonetheless. Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard choices for Walter Reuther. I think recognized that you're threading a very thin needle all the time in auto. And I don't know that they've arrived at that recipe. I don't know that the companies have. I mean, right now, how many bosses do the companies really have? Who's your boss? Well, is it the shareholders? Yes. Is it the workers? To some extent, yes, through the UAW, a third party. Is it government? Well, that's a big yes now. Because I think the biggest force driving the behavior of these auto companies now is the federal government and the states that are empowered by the federal government to adopt their own emission standards that are copied by other states.
Totally agree.
So I want to get back to this issue of Volkswagen and what John was asking about in terms of Toyota and Honda. So last year in the United States, Volkswagen sold 329,000 vehicles. Last year in the United States, Ford sold 751,000 F-Series trucks. Now, all of the 329,000 vehicles that Volkswagen sold in this country were not built in Chattanooga. Good percentage were because there were Atlases and Atlas Sports and ID4s. So to what extent is this really a small symbolic win that, as we go back to the earlier thing of the, historically they've been trying, Germany is embracing of a different type of union, but still recognizes the trade union movement. The big three, this has been part of their fabric since the 1930s. But for companies like Toyota and Honda in the United States, it's something completely different. If one of those tips, that's something. I mean, I could see Mercedes going almost for the same reason Volkswagen goes. Okay, it's more symbolic than substantive. Do you guys agree or disagree?
Well, I would say, I think the argument the union's making, I'm not saying whether, if it's the right one to make or not, but what I think Sean Fain really believes is that, what they're fighting for is kind of transcends company, almost even transcends the auto industry. And it's more, obviously that working class versus management class sort of battle, war. And he argues that workers, whatever the company, however good they treat you, however many products you're building, are simply fed up. And with the economic conditions, your dollar doesn't go as far anymore. And yeah, you may have a great employer. Things may be pretty good, but it's a little bit tougher when you go to the grocery store. It's a little bit harder when you go try to buy a car, and that the union is the vehicle to make things better for them. And he's hoping that argument will translate in whatever plant you're in, even if it's Tesla, even if it's Rivian or Toyota, et cetera. And, we've seen that beyond the auto industry, in the fight at Amazon and Starbucks, but that's what he's hoping. I don't know if that'll work. And, you could point to the fact that things at the other plants have been pretty slow. They've only announced a few others that have even gotten to 30% of authorization support cards. So it may be that they're not buying what Fain's selling there.
Well, I would say you raised a really interesting point. When you take a look at let's segment the domestic auto industry into two parts, the unionized part and the non-unionized part. In the unionized part, you have 3 companies, 2 of which are American-based. In the 13 or more non-unionized companies, you have 3 American companies, electric vehicle companies, and the rest are foreign-based. You take a look at Volkswagen at Chattanooga. I think I looked at the numbers for 2023. Only 1/9 of Volkswagen's production of actual units was made in North America. And these companies, even Tesla is a global company, but these foreign-based companies are really genuinely global, as is Stellantis. You can't go to them as a public official and say, it's really important that you build your manufacturing in sites in the United States and protect American jobs. You can do that with Ford and GM. It may play variously well, depending upon who's in the leadership position and the economics of it. But what is to keep them from saying, as you suggested, you're such a small part of the overall pie, we're not going to mess with that. If you're going to give us even more of a headache we have, why are we going to locate any more of our facilities here? And I think that's why the governor signed this letter. That's why they're concerned that these companies won't make further investments. And they're not foolish. They know how difficult it is dealing with an American union and an American workforce. Our workforce is much more heterogeneous, much more difficult to manage for a variety of different reasons. We have a very legalistic system and a pluralist society in which you have workers at Google protesting over wars and, using, sit-ins in the offices. In some other countries, you wouldn't see that. But you have a situation which is, I think, pretty ripe for the loss of jobs and the exodus of the auto industry from the U.S. So we could end up being like Australia, in which we lose our industry.
So I got to go. We're getting down towards the end here, but I'd love to get your guys' impression. What do you think Mary Barra, Jim Farley, and Carlos Zelenga at Stellantis are thinking right now? Are they glad that the union is making inroads, organizing the transplants against whom they have to compete and who have a cost advantage because they're not union? Or are they thinking, good, this is going to level the playing field for us, and it's a good thing?
Well, I'd say I don't know how happy they are because, again, you go back to previous contract negotiations, at least before now, 2019, 2015, et cetera. And one of the key arguments the Detroit Three always make is that we cannot give you as much as you want because we have to compete against non-unionized Volkswagen, Toyota, Honda, et cetera. So Shawn Fain's saying we're going to take away that excuse. We're going to make it so everybody has the same labor costs. Everybody's on the same playing field. So now, in his mind, he has more leverage. In his mind, Mary Barra, Jim Farley can't pinch pennies and withhold from workers significant raises in the future. But again, that supposes that they'll get wins at these other places too. I'm not sure how much just a Volkswagen plant or a Mercedes plant may tip the scales in negotiations at 2028. It would need to be pretty widespread. But I have to imagine, to a certain extent, the CEOs in Detroit aren't too happy because they're losing one of their strategies in negotiations.
I think that anything that strengthens the UAW potentially is going to have to be giving them cause for concern, because what comes around goes around. If they can be more strong in dealing with these now nominally non-union companies, except for Volkswagen in the U.S., they can be stronger vis-a-vis the big three. And their perspective has to be longer term, which is going to think, what is this industry going to look like under transitions to EVs when the dominant companies in the world are Chinese? We know that the largest markets in the world, you look at the top 10 markets, there are 5 Asian countries in that market, 3 European countries, and 2 North American countries. So I'm looking at the market, and Chinese market is twice as large as our market, and I'm saying, where am I going to sell cars going ahead? And if I got Chinese, in Mexico, and, Trump has laid it on the line. I think this will be, if he is able to survive these trials and actually get on the campaign trail and get the nomination and go forward, I think you will see in states like Michigan the transition to EVs, the heavy-handed role of government, and the future of manufacturing industries under this administration be one of the top issues going forward. And I don't think that's going to cut all in the Democratic side's favor. The Democratic Party of today, and I'm a Democrat, but the Democratic Party today is not the party of Bill Clinton or Hubert Humphrey. It's a much different party with a much different idea. Bill Clinton said in 1995 that the era of big government is over. If you look at the campaign materials for the Senate Democratic Campaign Committee, they'll say, we seek a bigger federal government.
And probably, unless you got another burning question there,
Oh,
Gary?
no, I go on all day.
Then I know we could go on.
These guys
but
go on.
No, this has been a great discussion, very detailed, very analytic. I really want to appreciate or express my appreciation for the both of you coming on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you too,
Yeah.
sir. Good to see you. I think the first time we've met, but we've talked a lot on the phone.
Exactly. Yeah.
He always educates me a lot.
Likewise.
And I should let everybody know I'm going to be on vacation for the next couple of shows, but Gary's going to take over, and you'll see him here next week. And look, if you're still listening, you got through all this, you must like this show. Please consider subscribing to our website and to our YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. And thanks for tuning in.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.